We're looking at Psalm chapter 17. And you'll notice that in the prayers of David that he certainly prays a lot because he's a lot of times in trouble. And so many of his prayers are what we call petitions, where he pleads for God to intercede. In this particular chapter, David is claiming innocence. That is, he has not done anything wrong and he's not transgressed or done anything of that nature. And so there's a couple of things that are very interesting in the psalm for just a moment, Psalm chapter 17. Now, if you notice, right in the very beginning, he'll ask the Lord to hear his right or his righteous cause. And so he wants God to examine almost as if in a court case. And of course, God is able to look not only at the outward circumstances of whatever's going on, but he also can scrutinize the heart. What's interesting, though, is his appeal and his is to God to vindicate him. In other words, he is not trying to vindicate himself, and his claim of innocence isn't based upon what he thinks the situation is. And that oftentimes sets David apart from most people, because when people claim to be right, oftentimes it's based upon their own opinions. Many conflicts, as you well know, that are argumentative. Both parties claim to be innocent or they're in the right. And so here, the appeal of David is not going to be in that realm, but his appeal about being right is going to be before God. And that's a very interesting concept because it's very seldom done. And so the argument is not that David feels that he's done right. He doesn't feel that he's transgressed. His conscience is clear. In his view, he's right. But his whole appeal is to the Lord to make judgment on that basis. So let's look again. Hear my right or my righteous cause. Give ear to my prayer that comes from unfeigned and guileless lips. So again, David isn't trying to be manipulative or to maneuver. And so oftentimes, when we deal with things like this, people are just doing that exactly. When you hear one side of the story, it sounds so good, and they may even think that they're right about it. But I just want you to notice again that he's appealing to a higher standard than himself. It is interesting when we get into this subject. So oftentimes people are very confused about what's right and wrong because they just don't have a standard. They believe they're right just because they believe they're right. And this is not just a problem of the individual, but it's a problem across the boards. Back in Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 20, you'll remember that famous verse where those who did evil called it good. And so without a standard and without appeal to the word of God, man is left to himself. You remember that the Bible says a man, what appeareth to be right or seemeth to be right, he talks about, or the end or the way of destruction in Proverbs chapter 14. So there's a difficulty sometimes about who's right and wrong because there is no standard to appeal to. And what's interesting again is think about how many disputes could be settled if we understood the proper standard. Now, verse number 2, let my sentence or vindication come from you. See, he's not appealing to himself. His claim of innocence not coming from himself, but his appeal is for God to judge him and examine to him, and he feels that he's right, but it's going to be left to God. Now, notice again, your eyes behold the things that are just and upright. Verse number 3, you have tried my heart. Isn't that interesting that God can do that? It is God who's doing the examination. David isn't doing the examination, but God is and he's appealing. Think about this in a prayer like this, that you appeal to God and you want God to prove you or test your heart and go on that basis. That's a tremendous statement to go before God in prayer. Then notice this, he said, I have purposed my heart again, or mouth, not to transgress. That's just a very familiar Bible word. Transgress just means to cross the boundary. Most of the time we deliberately do that. It isn't just that we transgress accidentally, but David is claiming that in his mouth what he's saying, his righteous cause, is that he has not transgressed. He hasn't violated the boundaries. Of course, when you don't have any boundaries, which is a challenging thing, of course, in our nation. If you don't have any boundaries and you don't have any standards, you see, you can't even make that appeal. Then in verse number 4, concerning the works by thy word. See how oftentimes that David is going back to that on the basis of the standard of God and his word is his appeal. And so oftentimes we neglect that. Now, in verse number 6, I want to go to 6, and it says here, and I want you to see this. This is one of the important, I think, verses in this particular prayer. Imagine for a moment that when you're praying to God, you expect God to answer. I don't know if everybody who prays has that anticipation, but David did. When David prayed to God, he expected God to answer him. And so he said, I called upon you, O God, for you will hear me. See, there's a declaration of faith, and we need to have that in our prayer life. Prayer is an act of faith, and so we ought to pray with expectation that God is going to answer, and not be foolish praying to God believing he will not answer. And so in verse number 8, and this is a favorite, this is probably a verse that people may know that don't even know the Bible. And so he'll say in verse 8, and guard me as the pupil of the eye. Now, in the old King James, it says the apple of the eye. It's an interesting phrase, because in the etymology, it referred to the little man of the eye. You see, if you get close enough, you can see your own reflection in the eye of another person. In other words, as you look, see, there's a closeness involved, and when you're really close and you look in the pupil of somebody else's eye, it's like a mirror. And of course, what he's talking about is for God to watch over him. But I want you to think about also the development of the word, because when you're close, somebody's dear to you and you're precious to him. And what he wants God to do is watch over him. And again, I want to just mention this, because in the life of David, there's one thing you can always see. He's not only oftentimes in trouble, but underneath that whole business is he's vulnerable. And so he wants God to keep a close eye on him, because God looks at him as precious. Isn't that something? I mean, would you like to pray like that? That God, I want you to watch over me like that. I want you to have a close watch, an intimate watch, that you are so close that you can actually see one's reflection in the eye of somebody else. Isn't that an amazing thing? To live in the presence that intimately, where God is watching over you that closely, and understanding he does that because you're precious in his sight. And there's the idea there of, I wish I could say more about that whole business of being in close fellowship with God. Now, of course, he goes on to say in the rest of the verse, not only the business of think about just being the apple of God's eye, isn't that something? But think about this. He wants God also to protect him in the shadow of his wings. Now, think about this. This is what Jesus said about Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem. How often would I see what Jesus was saying over there is he longed to protect them. He wanted to protect them and bring them under the shelter of his wings so they would be protected, but they refused. They wouldn't do it. And so this is a great psalm, these several verses. The rest of the chapter, of course, speaks about being delivered from his enemies. And we see so many times in David's prayers how much the enemies come into it. how oftentimes they were against him and opposing him. And he's asking God, you see, deliver him. What are we going to learn out of this? God really, if God really watches closely and he values you highly, and we ought to pray to God like this, God, that you want God to do that. And so I hope that as we're going through the Psalms, that these will be tremendously helpful to you. And we'll be looking tomorrow at Psalm chapter 18. I mean, we're already in Psalm 18 and we're moving very quickly. So these are great Psalms. I'm hoping that you're praying through the Psalms and you're learning more about prayer as you face the difficulties in so many different circumstances of life. So we'll see you tomorrow at Psalm chapter 18.